Rene Lichtman, born 1937, is a hidden child Holocaust survivor who opposes the ongoing Israeli genocide in Gaza. The son of two Polish Jews who fled to France during the 1930s, Rene was hidden at the age of 2 with a Catholic family outside of Paris after his father was killed during the 1940 Nazi invasion and his mother was forced into hiding. After the war, Rene moved with his mother to Brooklyn, New York. He was politically radicalized in the 1960s and became an active opponent of the Vietnam War. Rene was a founding member of the World Federation of Jewish Child Survivors of the Holocaust. On December 22nd, 2023, Rene took part in a demonstration outside of the Zekelman Holocaust Center in Farmington Hills, Michigan, against the US-backed Israeli massacres in Gaza. So welcome, Rene.
Thank you.
Hello. Of
Thank you.
course. Thank you so much for joining. So, I wanted to ask you before we get into your Palestine activism, can you tell us about your life and what happened to you during the Holocaust?
Yes, my parents were both from Poland, and as you said, they came to Paris uh, in 1933 and 1936. My mother in 1936, and I was born in 1937. Then uh, Poland was invaded, 39, and at that time, many young Polish Jews, like my father, with left wing leanings, many of those were young anti-fascist, and he joined the French army, and they put him in the Foreign Legion. And as soon as the war began, he was killed in action. My mother could not take care of me, so she was by herself in Paris, and so I stayed with this Catholic family for the entire war in Vergalon, it was called. And my mother, at some point in Paris, had to go into hiding, so I didn't see her until the war ended. So I spent the war years, 4 years of the war, with the family, with little knowledge of my mother because she had to go into hiding and stay there. She couldn't come and visit me anymore because it was too dangerous. So I didn't know anything about my Jewish identity. And with a lot of us children of the time, the identity was a pretty significant issue. And my mother, because of during the war, at the beginning, she could come and visit me once in a while. But at some point, the Germans, really just picked up anybody they could in the street. And it was too dangerous for her to come and visit me. So I had no real contact with her. And when she showed up to me, she was a stranger. She had a foreign accent. Kids suspicious of
Oh,
accent.
yeah.
She hardly spoke French. So at that time, I was 13 years old. I came to the United States and I lived in Williamsburg, in Brooklyn. And again, a very Yiddish speaking world. I was never religious. And then, of course, at some point, I went into the U.S. Army and came out, and I was painting. I was already drawing when I came to the States. I always drew, and I had fortunately some teachers who said, "Kid, you should go to this very special school in New York called High School of Music and Art," and that's where I got my art identity. And of course, I had my Jewish identity from that world that I came from, but it was not a religious. So I've always been an atheist, you could say, but very uh, understanding of my history as a Jew, et cetera, et cetera. And at some point, after I got a Fulbright grant in painting after I came out of the army, and then Vietnam occurred, so I became very involved in that. And at some point, I belonged to a group of filmmakers, artists, etc. And I came to Detroit and I helped make a film called Finally Got the News. And since then, I continued to be on the left. And I was always a Jew who was secular and very left wing. And I believed in those days in a democratic secular state for Palestinians and Jews living together. And I went to demonstrations representing Jewish leftists. And then that period ended. The war ended, and I went back to school. I got my PhD, and then I got a regular job. I had a family with 3 children, and so recently, of course, little by little over the years, Israel became more and more right wing, and I began to uh, object to that. So today, and I did spend, believe it or not, as a survivor, I spent 2 weeks volunteering in the military, Israeli IDF, the Defense Forces, with some other Jewish child survivors. We spent 2 years, 2 weeks, excuse me, helping. So I have pictures with my uniform in the army. And so I was pro-Israel, but I believed in 2 states.
There you
Yeah,
are. Okay,
and,
so this is you.
yeah, getting my epaulets, my little things, that I get some kind of certificate of my volunteer work. And after that, of course, um, you know, as the government became more and more right wing, and I became more and more anti-Israel or anti-Zionist, which leads me to today, where I've become more and more openly anti-Israel, anti-Zionist in that way. And I've become kind of a black sheep or a traitor or self-hating Jew. They call it, all these terms, which to me mean, at my age, I'm 86. I'm not impressed by those terms, but it makes me a kind of a pariah in some ways in the Jewish community, except among young people like If Not Now or Jewish Voice for Peace.
And so tell us about how your view of Israel changed. Did you have an aha moment? Was there something that Israel did that made you think, okay, this is a country, a government I don't support?
Yeah, and it's pretty recent when the right wing, and I knew the right wing because I knew from Brooklyn, I knew Maya Kahana because he was from Brooklyn. And I remember going back when I was living in Detroit and I settled in Detroit. I had my family in Detroit. I would go back to Brooklyn to visit my mother in Flatbush. And his posters were everywhere, Jewish Defense League and stuff. And I knew he was he was so far right that I would call him a Jewish fascist. But in those days, he was just a small group. And I still had hopes for, a 2-state solution. So I was aware of Kahana, and he goes to Israel. And I remember his party being outlawed because it's so far right. Well, now Kahana is a big hero. So it was a slow evolution in my thinking and my observation of what was going on in Israel. And I remember, learning that that there was hardly any left, and any left, you could say. And I had a dear cousin. She was part of my 4 girl cousins who were also in hiding and survived in France. One of my cousins became an ardent Zionist. She was recruited by the Zionists in France, and she made Aliyah. She went to um, to Israel to found the state, and she worked on the state in the state for the government actually as an agricultural expert. And I would visit her once in a while and contact her. And I remember at one point, and she was very secular. They were all leftists. They were all socialists or communists, that kind of thing. Um, and I remember visiting her and her saying to me, Rene, this is not the kind of state that we wanted to establish, which was they wanted to establish kind of a socialist state, secular. And already the rabbis and the religious establishment were taking over. And one of her daughters actually left Israel and moved back to Paris. She's still there. My cousin Chaya, who just passed away. So I watched the state lose its left wing leanings and becoming more and right wing to this point where we have these people that are pretty openly fascist. I would say they're called extremists or white supremacists or whatever they are. But their action, their behavior, as you can see, to me, it's such a shock what's going on in Gaza, what has gone on in the name of the Jewish people. It's beyond belief. And as someone who's been a speaker in the Holocaust Center here, and also in the general community. I've been invited to speak in schools a lot. And I always talk about at the end, you talk about the lessons of the Holocaust and you try to paint a kind of more positive picture as to the lessons. You talk about, lessons have taught me against stereotype, against intolerance, accepting diversity, things like that. Well,
And never
now,
again.
and never again to anyone, because that's what I meant. Of course, the right wing would say never again to the Jews. I mean, they're only interested in their issues. The thing about the Jewish community, they are the most oppressed. They're the biggest victims, right? There's a kind of a hierarchy of victimhood in the Jewish community, especially in the Holocaust and the survivor community, who suffered more. So even today, as they're doing these horrible things in Gaza, they see themselves, Israelis, Jews, here in Detroit, they see themselves as victims. And the oppressor is, the typical anti-Semites, or the Nazis, or now they're the Arabs or the Palestinians, and they're not real. The Jewish people have dehumanized Arabs. They've dehumanized in the same way, and I learned this a long time ago, the way that Americans dehumanized the Vietnamese. I remember the period when I was pretty active in the anti-Vietnam movement, where the propaganda that we had here, the media, we dehumanized Vietnamese. They were not human beings; they were gooks. And so, for target practice in the military, I remember seeing these. They would have these images of slant-eyed people, and they were all the enemies. So that gave permission to our U.S. soldiers to kill children because they were, of course, carrying grenades and justified killing civilians very much exactly the way Jewish troops today, these young kids who know nothing, these soldiers who've been brainwashed, are killing civilians. And this way, this time it's much worse because it's really not one-on-one contact where you're looking at the eyes of the civilian you're going to kill. This time it's from the air, right? A lot of it is just these long distance murder of civilians and children. And the alibi is, well, they're using them as human shields, which is it's just lies. And I learned that years ago, little by little, as these various operations by the Israelis against Palestinians have occurred, that there were all these excuses that the Israeli military had. They were using civilians as human shields. And I remember, again, the terrorists were doing that. And I remember saying, it's really strange. There were all these children who've been killed, who've been used as human shields. But so if you've killed the terrorists, where are these terrorists? All these terrorists that have been killed. You never see who they are, really, because a lot of them are just civilians. But those are the excuses that the Jewish people and the media, especially the media in Israel and the media in the United States, put forward. So Jews do not see Arabs or Palestinians, especially, as we've dehumanized them. And I see it as genocide. I see it as equivalent. It's difficult for me to say that, but it's equivalent to what happened in the Holocaust. Now, you could say the numbers are different. You can get into all these distractions, etc. But in terms of what it's doing and what it's done to first the Holocaust, I could never, as a speaker, I'm sure these speakers like myself, they're being asked at the end of their talk at a Holocaust museum or in school, well, you've suffered so much. How do you explain what you've done in Gaza? How do you explain that? All these civilians who've been killed, all these children, and I'm supposed to represent children. I talk a lot about children because 1.5 million Jewish children were murdered by the Germans. And how did they do that? One way it was explained by Himmler, one of the Nazis, why these Germans were killing civilians and children because these German soldiers were having PTSD in those days. They were killing civilians. And we know they were having those issues, emotional issues, because they wrote home letters to their family about that. And they complained to their officers that they were killing civilians and they didn't sign up for that. And to the degree where Himmler, second in command in the Nazis, went out in 43 and 44 to the Eastern Front and gave them pep talk. And he said to them, if it's very difficult for you Germans to be killing civilians. We know that because you're such a caring people. You have to kill these children because if you don't, they will grow up and be avengers. And that's the terminology he used, avengers. They will seek revenge on you for what you did to their family members. And that's what the Israelis are doing and saying and thinking when they kill Palestinians. It's preventive murder. If we don't kill them now, they will grow up and become avengers. And so, but what it's doing in practice, of course, it's creating recruits for the what I call the Palestinian resistance. And I've talked about this where I see the resistance, Hamas, uh, as equivalent to the Jewish ghetto uprising. I see them as resistance, as maybe not freedom fighters the way they were in Vietnam, but in the ghetto, in the Jewish ghetto, the young people, and they were always left wing, socialists or communists who organized this resistance. And their thinking was, we're going to be murdered, we're going to die, and we want to take some of them with us, which they did. They killed quite a few Germans. And Norman Finkelstein talks about that these young people in Gaza, which is an open air concentration camp, and he's not the only one that said that. A lot of political people have said that long before him, that Gaza is an open air concentration camp. You can't get in, you can't get out. These people are born there. They're the second generation from the Nakba, where they were kicked out of Israel. They went to Gaza. They were born there. They lived there. They're going to die there. And with that mentality, I could see where young people joining resistance, and the resistance would be Hamas. And the Nakba, I would say, by the way, it's not like it happened once. It's been, I'm not the only one saying that. Analysts have said that as well. It's continued until today. The Nakba has really, that the Israelis have always have continued to try to kick out the Palestinians. The Nakba was when about 800,000 Palestinians were, during the War of Independence, um, all these Palestinians left, either from their own accord or there was terrorism against them, their villages, etc. They left thinking they could come back. But of course, once they left, the Israelis, the Zionists, realized we're not going to let them back in. And that kind of mentality still continues. So in the West Bank, you have the settlements, and where they're still trying to kick out Palestinians, and they want to do the same thing with Gaza. So they have this, the whole land being free of Palestinians.
So you said that you became critical of Israel after it turned right wing, but from what you're saying right now, the founding of Israel through the Nakba was, I mean, ethnic cleansing, right? So is it that you didn't know about that, or you kind of didn't pay attention to it? Were you in denial of it?
Yeah, I didn't. I knew. Yeah, denial is a big part. I mean, today especially. I mean, the Israeli people, and I'm saying this. Gideon Levy is the person you want to listen to
Yeah, the
on
Israeli journalist. Yeah.
the Israeli journalist who's just really, really. So I learned a lot through these people that are part of what's called the new historians. There's about 3 or 4 or 5 of them who have, written these books. Of course, they're they're now called, the traitors, et cetera, et cetera. They've had to leave. They couldn't get work. A lot of them in Israel. They've gone
Ilan
in other
Pape,
places.
for instance.
Pape is one of them, and Avi
Benny
Schlein,
Morris used to be one of them, but that's
Benny
a whole other
Morris,
story.
exactly,
Yeah.
and Norman Finkelstein, of course, who has to. We have to recognize in terms of the Israeli lobby, the Jewish lobby, in terms of its influence on the U.S., especially the Congress, and politicians paying them off all these years and helping to brainwash Jewish children. A lot of them Jewish children who at some point realized when they went to Israel on these trips, well, wait a minute, there's all these other people there. Now, fortunately, I was given a tour by friends of mine in Jerusalem of the West Bank. And these friends of mine that were still there in Israel and Jerusalem, they're part of these kind of human rights groups where they sit and they observe the border so that these soldiers don't humiliate. Humiliation is a big part. And the Israeli military learned that from the Nazis as well. The Nazis, the first step the Nazis were going to do was humiliate the Jews by cutting off their beards or making fun of them, etc., etc. And the Israelis do the same thing to the Arabs. And so, and they do that, for example, at the border. These young um, soldiers with these guns humiliate Palestinians at the border who are coming into work, etc. So these friends of mine are at the border, making sure that doesn't go on, And so these friends took me to the West Bank. I saw the conditions, not completely, but I was very aware of the two worlds. That's apartheid. Apartheid. I remember recently, well, you couldn't use a word like that. You couldn't use genocide, etc. But the last 3 or 4 months, we've learned that no, it applies. People now use the word genocide, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, all these terms that are part of our vocabulary because even the main media in the United States has been forced to recognize that. And so I little by little, I realized but I was always hoping for a two-state solution, and I still do, and I think it's still possible. People can get along if you don't have these people, whipping up hatred. And today you've got the extreme right wing in Israel who want to. I mean, Bibi is considered a centrist, believe it or not. Netanyahu, compared
Right.
to these, yeah.
What is the connection between Never Again and what is happening now in Gaza? And why is it that more people don't make the connection between what happened to the Jews and the Holocaust and what's happening to Palestinians today? Why do you think you're able to see that, but so many people aren't?
Well, the media has a lot to do with it. Um, the Jewish leadership. I mean, just think of it. You know, we got rabbis all over the world. Now, do the rabbis ever talk about that? In what kind of language do they use? No. And I know this from personally because I've been through, a bunch of synagogues over my lifetime with my kids uh, until today, where there was a very, very liberal um, congregation where, I thought the rabbi was very liberal. And then it turned out to, at one point there were these calls for we stand for Israel during what Hamas did, right? So what Hamas did was, boy, it was seized upon by the right wing leadership in this country, in the United States, as these are savages. It was used to paint the Palestinians as savages. This is language that they use, animals. They cut off the breast of women. They killed children. They rape women. All of these lies, they've been shown to be lies, but they've hid the media and American media, which is sold, bought off by the corporation. It's called the corporate media for a reason. Um, it's bought off, and a lot of it by the APAC crowd. ADL is part of the Jewish lobby and all of these other billionaires. And so a lot of the population in the United States is completely ignorant, especially the Jewish community, the Jewish newspapers. I read some of that press, but the rabbis notice they never. There's a few voices that speak up and talk about Jewish values. Now, I have to say, Jewish values are the ones that influenced me in my so-called left wing, but also other voices, Catholic Worker, Dorothy Day, people like that, those Christian social revolutionaries and stuff like that. So the rabbis don't say anything, and if you do say something, whether it's Cornel West or um, um, uh, Chris, some of these other voices, you
Chris
get
Hedges.
Chris Hedges, Norm Finkelstein, you get destroyed. You get destroyed in terms of your career, your job, your family. You can't do anything. I call it Jewish McCarthyism. If you know anything about McCarthyism, and I knew people who were the subjects of McCarthyism, who were blacklisted, et cetera, et cetera. So I knew people with, John Garfield and that family in New York and others, Zero Mostel. And um, so that had a big influence. So I consider this Jewish McCarthyism where you speak up. And in my case, I can say that because of my age and the fact that I'm retired. And, so I don't care anymore. But, when my last rabbi stood up and he said, I stand for Israel, I just got so, which is very recent. Before that, he was standing up for Rashida Tlaib. Suddenly he changed his tune.
Wow.
I stand for Israel. When all the rabbis were being pressured in Detroit to stand up for Israel, that's it. That was the litmus test. If you didn't, you're going to catch hell. That means your congregation, the people that give money to it's a money issue. It's your fundraisers locally. They would leave. Your congregation would splinter. I experienced that when Trump was elected. I belonged to a conservative synagogue at that time, and I realized that half of my friends who were socially progressive on the question of Palestine, they weren't so
Yeah,
progressive.
there's a term for that. It's called PEP, Progressive Except on Palestine.
Exactly, progressive except on Palestine. And when I realized that these friends were, pretty right wing and pro Trump and pro Israel, I left that congregation because I realized that the rabbi would never say in the next year or 4 years would never say anything hostile to the present government. So it leaves you kind of alone. But that's the price. There's been other people. My role models again. I feel like part of the. There's an international community of people that believe in social justice, and I was starting to talk about where my values come from. They come from doing learning about the Old Testament, about the Jewish tradition. I always learn about you care for the justice, justice, justice. You shall
Tikkun
see.
Olam.
Tikkun olam, and you care about the widow and the orphan and the homeless. Those are the values that I believe in. Now, those are not the values of the right wing in Israel. As a matter of fact, the right wing, and there are some rabbis who've written about that, who are very right wing, and they say all this tikkun olam is baloney. They believe that the Jews belong on this land and nobody else does, and we're the most oppressed, and therefore because of the Holocaust we've been so oppressed that we can do anything and the world will not criticize us. So that when you think of European countries, they have such guilt still, including the Germans, about what they did, that they will not say a word against the Israeli leadership.
Right. And they make Palestinians though pay for their crimes. The Germans do.
Exactly, yes, they're able to kind of transfer that guilt. Um, but I think the issue today. I remember there was a period a couple of years ago where in Europe, um, the suddenly the Jewish community was not being attacked as a scapegoat for various issues, but it was the immigrants, these Muslim Arab immigrants that were the enemy, and that's still the situation. The enemy, in Europe is the foreigner, and that means the dark-skinned people, or Africans, North Africans, etc. And so things have changed in Europe, but that's anti-foreign sentiment and right-wing equivalent. Israel right wingers have allies in France and Italy, where they're also right wing, also fascistic in terms of their views.
Well, thank you so much, Renee, for joining, and we'd love to have you back.
Thank you. Anytime. As things develop, I mean, it's not this. We're going through a period of change. Hopefully, they can. Anyway, it's hard to predict. Thank you very much.